Welcome to this special Red Alert China edition of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, hosting today. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to hit the like button, also comment, share, and subscribe. To enjoy sneak previews of our videos, exclusive content, and more special programming in the works, join our Patreon page, patreon.com/thoughttoaction. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to our Ask Us Anything sessions, where we at the London Center answer your questions. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Parler, and our website, londoncenter.org. We're also on Rumble as well. In recent days, the CCP has presented new threats, both via their military tech and diplomatically. China's launched a hypersonic missile, revealed plans for a super aircraft carrier, and it's been practicing some rather interesting war games, all while pushing political threats towards Taiwan. Our panelists from the London Center are here to talk about it. They are Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, the president of the London Center for Policy Research, Lieutenant Colonel British Army retired Tim Wilson, senior fellow, and Navy Captain retired Pete O'Brien, distinguished fellow. Gentlemen, let's start. China's testing of the hypersonic missile and the U.S. possibly now having to play catch-up onto the CCP, and a new high-tech aircraft carrier will be ready out of Beijing in 2022. Where do we stand on this, and what do you think our nation and our leadership should be doing about it right now?
The hypersonic missile is important in many ways, and it's dealing with that sort of thing is very complex, but it's worth remembering that anytime you launch to space, you're effectively going hypersonic. And intercontinental ballistic missiles are hypersonic weapons, for example. So China has had a space launch capability for quite a long time, and the development of their hypersonic missiles is a serious threat, but it is something about which we in the US know a fair amount of the technology involved, and have been working on defenses, for example, under the Strategic Defense Initiative, of dealing with missiles traveling at hypersonic velocities. So it's concerning, it's deeply concerning, and it shows a number of areas that, in a number of ways, that the technology that China is developing is advancing very rapidly, which is, of course, of real concern. However, personally, I'm not yet terrified at the thought of China with hypersonic missiles. We've got them. We have some defenses against them. We're developing defenses against them constantly and have been for many years.
I think there's issues that relate to why we were withdrawing from a number of agreements during the Trump administration, INF being one of the most important. One of the things we recognized very early on is the Chinese were not bound by any international agreements. And so when we were living up to our treaty obligations for nuclear missile restrictions that were designed during the Cold War for the Cold War, it made absolutely no sense that we continue to maintain that, not for purposes of antagonizing Russia, although Russia was antagonized by our withdrawal. It was made very clear through a number of public and private statements that we're doing this based on a new threat, and that is China. So what Tim just said is absolutely correct. I think there's things we've been doing to monitor and balance our thinking. With that said, I think the Chinese have shown they're a little bit further ahead than we expected, which is, it shouldn't be a surprise that we were surprised based on the current decrepit status of our intelligence community and DoD. The thinking there is very soft and almost to the point of where there's no critical thinking. And when you remove critical thinking and the ability to actively and aggressively pursue clandestine intelligence operations to figure out what the leadership is doing in China, then you're going to come across things like this when they decide to overtly act. Speaking of overtly acting, I think that's the other thing that we have to recognize is that within the context of the Chinese leadership, they're not monolithic. They have essentially elements within their government which are always competing for power, because their power is essentially a communist system. You have the people in charge of their government. Well, the people are actually little small tribes which compete for their power. And you have ministers always doing one thing or another. There's a great movie to kind of watch how this is greatly expressed. It's called The Death of Stalin. Well, it's not about China. I think it has a great, it illustrates clearly in a very comical but accurate way how bad things are for those who are in a communist system. So I think those are the things that we should really pay attention to regarding, should we be worried about hypersonics? Well, of course, it's a weapon. But I think we should be more worried about what we don't know about what the Chinese are intending regarding intentions.
First, I'd just like to say, add a few bits about the technology involved here. The Chinese fired off a missile, what is known as a fractional orbital bomb system. It's a missile that is actually puts the reentry vehicle and the bus into orbit rather than simply a partial trajectory like throwing a baseball. And the missile actually is aimed south, goes over the South Pole, comes back up at in this case, the United States. The Russians were the first ones to deploy one of these. They had a number of them that they deployed with the SS-9 missile back in 66 or 67, I believe. And they represent an alertment problem, and that you're not looking in the right area to see the darn thing. It is, and the hypersonic reentry vehicle was on the top of that FOBS, fractional orbital bomb system. So there is an alertment issue. We're still in the realm of nuclear exchange and all that entails. So it's not like this is happening out of the blue and we don't understand it, or that it's radically escalating the problem. It is another element of a nuclear strike capability. It needs to be addressed. It is not the end of the world, but we need to be diligent in addressing it. That said, as both Tony and Tim have hinted, there is a very large political issue here that is really the greater issue. And when you look at President Xi, Chairman Xi, Emperor Xi, there's some interesting things that he just came out with just recently. He was labeled he actually passed one of the great resolutions or something that it's only been done twice before. I think it's a resolution. That's the term of art they used. Mao had one. Deng Xiaoping had one. Let me just check the term. Yeah, it is a resolution. It's one of 3 resolutions now that the Chinese leadership have passed out in 72 years. It is a demonstration from Xi's perspective that he is now on par with Mao. Mao was the great helmsman. Xi is now being referred to as the great navigator. His thought is now the term they're using, the core of the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a question. There's an interesting question. This is, why is he doing this? Is he doing this because he's comfortable in his position of power, or is he doing this because he's trying to establish that he is in fact the guy in charge, and that there is stress inside, and he's struggling now. He's dancing faster to make sure he maintains control. And the sort of general consensus among the folks who study China diligently is that it's the latter, that there is a control issue right now in the leadership in the Chinese Communist Party, if you will, center, and that she has some real struggles, and that makes for a destabilizing environment. And I think it's important to put in context is that as she looks around at opportunities to establish his authority and opportunities to essentially make everybody look in the right direction, you have a whole bunch of things going on elsewhere in the world, to include Belarus threatening Poland and Russia threatening eastern Ukraine, would provide huge amounts of if you will, distraction for the rest of the world, on top of all the other things that we're dealing with, environment, economies, viruses, etc. That would give him an opportunity to essentially exploit the fog of war. And I think we're entering into a very dangerous period.
If I may as well, just to loop that a bit further on, the economics effects are also important. One of the destabilizing factors internal to China is their economic situation. The whole world suffered under the Wu flu, and China took a hit that affected their internal economics as well as the rest of the world. And when you talk about hypervelocity missiles, you're talking about things that are incredibly, programs that are really, really expensive. So the competition for resources that Pete's just mentioned across the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party really matters. And external dynamics like the threats to Taiwan matter because that's used by, it's out of the dictator's playbook of, you know, I'm in trouble, I'll throw a war. That makes those threats very real. But it's not as simple as China can just produce everything it wants. It needs the money to do so. And one of the things that helped very much to bring down the Soviet empire was, of course, the economic factor of getting into an arms race.
Yeah, to follow that up, I think Tim is completely correct on the need to study their own internal challenges and stresses. And Pete and I, as former planners on this issue, I think recognize, especially since Pete was at SINCPAC a long time, that we recognized even back then that there were a number of internal weaknesses which, if exploited, could collapse the whole house of cards. And I think that's something that I believe we should have been messaging on much more strongly. It's like, yeah, we don't want to mess with you, but we will. Because I think the moment you give them the idea that we're not going to do anything, the more aggressive they're going to become because they think there's going to be no consequences. And this thinking is what resulted in Japan overplaying its hand and starting World War II. The belief was, we can beat them in 6 months and be done with it. Obviously, it didn't happen. And the consequences were grave for both sides, more for them than us, but it still required that a hot conflict exists. One of the things that I think we've been remiss in is reminding the Chinese that, you know, Tibet, the reason I don't think people fully understand why is China in Tibet? Well, the China is in Tibet because that's where all the water for all these big rivers come from, and they want to control that. So we may want to remind them, it's like, yeah, we could make your life really miserable economically and resource-wise, because so much of their population, billions of people, depend on their government continuing to develop resources for sustainment. You know, and I don't think we make it clear. It's like, if we really decided to engage in economic warfare and mess with you, your life would be hell. And I do believe that that should be part of our strategy. Is like, if we really want to deter them, then deter them. Don't sit back and try to make nice and placate them with all these things, which is never worked within the history of deterrence or within the history of our relationship with the People's Republic of China. So I think it's time we become much more realistic in how we develop strategies to push back.
When you look at China writ large, they're net importers of food, they're net importers of fuels and energy. They have a whole host of nearby pressures that they need to constantly monitor. The water that flows in the Indus and the Ganges rivers start in the Himalayas. They start essentially in Tibet. The Indians are very concerned about that sort of thing. The river, the flow of water into all of Southeast Asia. All of Southeast Asia's water starts in the Himalayas. You know, so there's huge amounts of political pressure. Well, you could say, well, those people then need to play nice with the Chinese. Arguably yes, arguably no. If you recall that the Vietnamese were the ones who decided to not play nice at all in 1979, when the Chinese decided to pressure the Vietnamese with their army, and wound up with a very bloody nose as a result. So that these are very difficult political situations that the Chinese are dealing with. They are right on their doorstep. They're right next door. And if we had some kind of cogent long-term plan, we would be using those very real stresses to, if you will, send a clear signal to the Chinese to stay in their lane.
Right.
If I may as well, another great vulnerability of China. They talk about, Taiwan terribly aggressively. If the administration was serious about it, they would mention that China's greatest vulnerability is their energy imports. They currently import something like 75 to 80% of their oil from the Middle East. That goes by, a lot of it, a huge amount of it goes by tanker.
Right.
There are all sorts of choke points along the way, plus these things would then be sailing. Let's put it like this. Many of the ships that would be carrying that oil are in semi-hostile flagged ships anyway. So from America's point of view, to actually embargo those, to prevent them successfully completing their journeys would not be a great loss to America. Our energy independence that we achieved under the last president that is now fading is hugely vital in all of this.
Well, and as Pete knows, one of the first points of strategy after the U.S. Navy engaged in World War II was to go after the Japanese merchant fleet to essentially cut off the Japanese homeland from resources. So I can't believe the Chinese haven't studied this, because it's not just us now who have submarines. So, I mean, the Indians, the Australians, I don't know if Vietnam has a submarine fleet yet, but I'm sure that they could do things to disrupt that oil supply through the China Straits. Yep. So I think there's huge vulnerabilities in the Chinese, and I said this because it's something that I worry about for our own population. What's worse than 100 million dead people, 100 million starving people who are still alive? And you start doing things to mess with people. You don't want to kill them. You make them a permanent problem that they have to deal with. And I just don't think we're being as steely-eyed as we should regarding how to deal with China.
And that leads us to China's increased aggression toward Taiwan. We've discussed a possible military takeover, but the Chinese government has said, wait a minute, we can handle this diplomatically. We can take over Taiwan or strong-arm them without military force. How worried should we be about that? And why haven't we been looking that way?
There's two things that we've touched upon already regarding Chinese leadership, and they're a bit of a diverse view of what's best for China. There are different elements, different tranches, different tribes, different terms for that. I don't think the Communist Party is unified in its thinking as one might think. And that's resulted in kind of the military wanting to do one thing, other elements of the political class wanting to do others. And it's resulted in kind of this mixed message. I think the Chinese military is ramping up to do something militarily. I think that's why you've seen them invest in huge modernization, aircraft carriers, things like this. Projecting power has always been one of their shortcomings. And that's something that would be hugely necessary to be able to do something in Taiwan. So I think there's more reasonable voices which have prevailed to kind of walk back a lot of the bellicose language and intent, because obviously, while Joe Biden said out loud what we intend to do is to support Taiwan, it would be bloody for both sides. And again, I think China has to recognize the huge strategic vulnerabilities they maintain should the entire Pacific Rim turn against them. And any aggressive action against Taiwan, I think, would turn all except for North Korea against them in a war. So I think that's my opening view of why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, a strong factor in all this is, of course, the will of the nations involved. National will, when you get into a major conflict, is hugely important, and that's where Roosevelt did such a good job, even during the build-up before Pearl Harbor, and then when that speech that he gave immediately after Pearl Harbor, of the day that will live in infamy, roused the nation, and the national will of the United States became determined to defeat not just Japan, but the Axis powers of Japan and Germany in particular. And that was so vital to how the Second World War was actually won. The military operations aren't always kinetic is the other part of this. And the military planners everywhere look around at if some bad event happened, such as a kinetic conflict with Taiwan or a pre-kinetic conflict with Taiwan, how do you break the will of the people? And if you can do that before the kinetics start, you can win the war without firing a shot. And their threats, I mean, they are a huge nation. They have 1.4 billion people. They have the resources of 1.4 billion people. Taiwan is a relatively small nation in numbers, and one has to wonder how strong their will would be in the event of serious threats of kinetic warfare. China has been using every avenue. At the moment, Taiwan is standing strong. Long may it continue. The thing that I believe in is that the rest of us who support Taiwan should be constantly emphasizing the weaknesses of China and the fact that they can't sustain a long war, for example, because of the energy problem that we just discussed. And Taiwan, if it can hold out for long enough, will prevail.
I think that's an important point to make, is that if the Taiwanese stand strong, taking an island 100 miles out from your starting point is by no means a given. We moved 3.5 million men to England over a 2-year period. We had several tens of thousands of aircraft. We had literally thousands of ships stockpiled up, ready to go, practiced to make a 57-mile crossing and land in the beaches of Normandy. And it was horribly difficult to do. And the idea that the Chinese can do this, if you will, whimsically, they can do it easily, is ridiculous. The first thing that comes to my mind is that they haven't conducted a large-scale training evolution at all. Nobody in the Chinese army has ever gone and conducted a multi-division amphibious assault on a friendly beach, never mind on a opposed beach. So the idea that they can do this purely militarily and to succeed is a reach, which leads you back to what Tim was just talking about, the idea of from an information warfare perspective, strategic communications, economic warfare, political warfare, cyber warfare, all the warfares, all the different facets of a society brought to bear on your target, which is something that the Chinese have the capability of, are going to be necessary to weaken the target to the point where you can actually succeed in doing this. Doesn't mean you will. Amphibious warfare, amphibious assaults are really, really easy to screw up. That needs to be remembered is that there are a relatively short number of things that you can do to make that final assault where they actually go and take control very expensive. Now, yeah. And the Chinese know this. There are Chinese generals sitting there in Beijing who, when someone asks them in private, "Can we do this?" are going to say, "Well, it's going to depend. It's going to depend on a whole host of things, and here's our list of assumptions." And give you a list of 20 assumptions. If all these things happen, it's going to be a cakewalk. If this doesn't happen, well, then it gets hard. And if this doesn't happen, and anybody who's ever looked at any planning at all for any kind of amphibious assault or any kind of assault, an airborne assault, will tell you. And it's like it's very easy to go from this is going to be sweet to, oh my God, why did we even think about doing this? So the Chinese are facing that dilemma constantly. Doesn't mean they won't do it. Doesn't mean Xi couldn't wake up tomorrow and say, "I don't care what your problems are, General. Just do it." But there are going to be some issues.
Yeah, and to reinforce what Pete said, if anyone who studies the Pacific Campaign, I don't remember it was Guadalcanal, I think it was Tarawa, where even after the United States had done a few of these, still got things hugely wrong, like putting the landing craft on the beach at low tide. It's like, that's probably not a good idea. But I think this is where the Chinese would have to really take on and learn some huge muscle movement tasks that they've never done. And Pete and I have had to deal with logistical idiots most of our career where someone wants something done. Well, it's, okay, you can want that, but this is the reality. And by the way, as a reminder to the audience, this was such an important issue for the United States that we would, during the Cold War, use something called reforger, return of forces to Germany, because the logistical aspects of just big movements of material, personnel, and weapons was so huge to understand how it worked. We had to exercise just on that point. So with no experience in expeditionary operations, even short ones, the Chinese would be hard pressed to put together an effective force to do it. Now, again, as Pete says, not to say that they're not going to try it, that they just are just told go do it, but it would not result in a positive outcome that I think that they would be hoping.
And that's an important point. Is if you've got a bunch of 3-star and 4-star officers standing around talking to Emperor Xi, there's going to be a real concern here. Is we need to make sure we get this right, because what we don't want to do is start this thing and fall flat in our faces in front of the entire planet. If we can figure out a way to do this, and this doesn't mean they can't, they could, we can figure out a way to do this where we walk in and this goes fast, and it's like Desert Storm 1991, this 100 hours of conflict, and geez, it just goes beautifully. If we can figure that out, it will be awesome.
Yeah, and you have to remember, just at that point, we were at the pinnacle of our Cold War capability. I mean, just like the Cold War ended, and we happen to have this battle to go do. It's like, let's go do something. And frankly, I mean, Schwarzkopf was the graduation. I don't know if you remember this, Pete. Schwarzkopf was the graduation speaker at my Motzi graduation. And it just so happened we had the right generals at the right time with the right equipment, after the right training, after decades of preparing for something regarding moving big pieces of men, material, and what Iraqis were like, just like the receptors of what we would have given the Soviets had anything ever gone wrong. With that said, we couldn't do that today. There's no way we could pull off a Desert Storm today if we wanted to. It's something that actually, I think, well, I don't want to say this because it'll get me in trouble. I think it over demonstrates what we can do. Not to say we couldn't do it. It's just you can't pick up and do a Desert Storm just because you want to. It's something that actually takes a great deal of preparation and training to do. So
absolutely, and again, geography comes into it. Taiwan is not just an island that is 100 miles off the coast of China, and therefore with a 100-mile wide moat with all the alligators that involves, but it's also a very mountainous island. I've looked at it from the perspective of an insurgency type resistance and said to myself, that place is perfect for it. So they could take, Taipei, they could take the cities around the coast fairly quickly. That doesn't mean they've conquered Taiwan.
Going back to the Chinese military, how should the U.S. respond to China's creating mock U.S. ships as target practice? Now, the symbolism is obvious, but how worried should we be that they gain such reportedly intimate details about our ships?
Espionage is a key factor in any type of warfare. The Chinese, we now know for decades, have been practicing serious espionage. And the reports about their latest carrier, number 3, which is due to come off the yards maybe next year. Well, there's an awful lot could be said about that, but I'll leave that aside. There are reports that may include electronic catapults rather than steam catapults for the first time. If that's true, where did they get the technology for that? One has to suspect they stole it from America. And, that sort of thing is vitally important. But the targets being, let's put it like this, aircraft carrier recognized around the world as vitally important targets in any military conflict. What shape are aircraft carriers? I mean, I find the fact that they've drawn shapes on the ground that resemble American aircraft carriers. Well, one could say that it also resembles their latest aircraft carrier number 3, which is of the same or very similar configuration. A target's a target. At the end of the day, they could have drawn rectangles. They've chosen to draw something that is close to what we use. Does it matter? Not to me.
So on that point, during the preparation for the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese had done essentially a miniature version of Pearl Harbor for purposes of training their pilots. It didn't seem to help them all that. I mean, I'm not diminishing their attack. They were effective. They should have done the third wave of attack. They didn't. They were very accurate in several of their plans relating to how to deploy the first two waves. Didn't get the carriers, thank goodness. But with that said, it didn't matter. A tactical experience without strategic understanding is still going to result in a failure. I think Sun Tzu even says something about that. Tactics before strategy is the noise before defeat, or something like that. I don't remember the exact quote, but I think it's more provocative than effective in the way they're presenting they're doing this.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in on a simple thought there, and then I'll get back to something Tony was also on. A ship sitting in the desert isn't a ship. And if they want to practice shooting missiles at a shape on a pile of sand, feel free. If they want to practice against a floating target that's actually moving, they're going to find that a slightly different problem. And I know they fired at ships at sea. There was an article in, I think it was Jane's Defense Weekly, probably 20 years ago, about them firing at a target barge that was moored in a fixed point, absolutely rigid, not moving at all, and they fired at it. Again, that doesn't prove much. Finding a moving ship at sea, and particularly one that's mixed in with commercial cargo shipping, and putting the round on the right target, that's a different kettle of fish. Not that I'm making light of their capabilities. They have great capabilities, but when we look at it, we need to make sure we recognize when someone is 10 feet tall, when someone is 6 feet tall, when they're only 4'9". And it's important to understand what the real threat is. And I am fairly confident that our Navy understands the differences. The other side of it, though, is as Tony says, and I'll quote the great German general from the middle of the 1800s, the fellow who put together the actual tactical assault into France during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Field Marshal Moltke, the elder, is that errors in tactics can be corrected in the next battle. Errors in strategy can only be corrected in the next war. They can spend a lot of time getting their tactics right. If they get the tactics right and the strategy wrong, it's going to be a long, long day.
Yep. Can I just add as well that it may say something about the psychology involved and what have you, but that's a two-edged sword. That's the way to motivate our own people, and making threats, as it were. Threats to me in international diplomacy are a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength.
If I could, Tim, I would say that goes back to this issue of internal concern. Again, they've got the largest number of ships. They've got the largest Navy in the world. They've got a very capable Navy. They've got capable platforms, capable weapon systems. I'm not saying anything at all against their capabilities. That's a capable force, and we need to respect it and address it and figure out how, if necessary, how to defeat it. But I think that there is a lot to be said here. Tim just said, this strange blustery behavior may be an indicator of just what we were talking about earlier, is that she is suffering from some very real internal concerns. And that part of it worries me much more than does the particulars of some weapon system.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's where we need to take a hard look. And again, I'll go back to this issue of, we've got 15,000 immigrants being used to pressure the Poles Meanwhile, we've got 2 Russian Army corps within 160 miles of the borders of eastern Ukraine. There are a lot of pieces being moved around on the world's chess set, and is she gonna see this as, geez, I need to pull a rabbit out of a hat, and now's the time? And I think that is a very real concern.
Thank you very much for being with us for this edition of Red Alert China on Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. Please remember to hit the like button. Feel free to comment on our discussion. We appreciate your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel and pound the big red bell for updates on future shows. Find out more about the London Center on our website, londoncenter.org. If you'd like to help us continue to create discussions and programming like this, please join us on Patreon at patreon.com/thought-to-action. You can also enjoy sneak previews, special exclusive content, and our Ask Us Anything sessions. Also, you can help us greatly by sharing this video with your friends, colleagues, and social networks. For our panel and the Herb London Center for Policy Research, I'm Chris Cordani. Thank you, stay informed, and make your day a great one.